in the aftermath of David's defeat of Goliath, cutting off his head, being exalted in the eyes of the people of Israel as their champion, as their leader, the huge defeat of the Philistines, I wonder what King Saul is thinking. I mean, after all, he's just been told, we don't know how many years have passed, but he's been told by Samuel that the kingdom has been torn from him. God's giving it to a neighbor who's better than him. And now Saul's looking out, and David is victorious. This young man, David, full of faith in the Lord, the young man that Saul himself had actually sent out into the battle, is now exalted in the eyes of all the people of Israel. I wonder what he's thinking. And then Saul hears singing. 1 Samuel chapter 18, the women start to sing in verse 7 to one another as they celebrate. Saul has struck down his thousands, and David his 10,000s. And Saul was very angry. David's getting the praise, and I think Saul's starting to realize very clearly that young man, who is he? David from Judah? That young man is the Lord's anointed. And you know what Saul's going to do the rest of his life? He's going to spend the rest of his life trying to kill God's anointed. And this really shouldn't be that surprising to us because we've read Genesis 3. Everything about the story is pointing us to this idea that David is the offspring of the woman, the one that God is raising up to lead his people back to God, to crush the heads of his enemies. Saul sees it, and he wants to kill him. Saul is like the offspring of the serpent, and there's conflict. And we're not going to go through much of the rest of 1 Samuel from chapters 18 to 31. You can read it on your own if you want, but 1 Samuel 18 to 31, basically Saul is spending all of the rest of his energy and his life trying to destroy David. He's plotting against him in every way. David is not blameless in this section. It doesn't seem like he does some things, maybe some lack of faith along the way, but he's on the run for his life, and God delivers him out of all of his troubles. No matter what Saul does, God always thwarts the plans of Saul because God's hand is on David. God has seen him, anointed him. And even if the king of Israel, Saul, wants to come with all of his armies against him, God can deliver David from it all. And as you read through it, God protects David in amazing ways, sometimes through Saul's own family, often, actually. Like David gets to marry Michal, Saul's daughter, as a reward from the defeat of Goliath. And there's a time in these chapters where Saul wants to kill David, and Michal, his own daughter, spares David's life from Saul. Perhaps most prominent in these chapters is Jonathan, Saul's own son, whose heart is fully devoted to David. It's one of the most beautiful pictures of friendship in the whole Bible. These guys are completely loyal to one another. They care for one another. They pledge themselves to one another to protect each other's families. And you think about it, Jonathan would be next in line to be the king. And yet he wants to see David exalted, God's anointed, and he spares David's life. He undermines the plots of his own father. Whatever Saul does, he's just growing weaker and weaker, more desperate and desperate. He's on the way down. David is on the way up. But perhaps the worst thing that happens in 1 Samuel 18 to 31 is what happens at a place called Nob. 1 Samuel chapter 22, David and his men who are on the run, as they often are in these chapters, seek help, some food, some refuge from some of the priests who are at Nob. And they don't even really know that David is on the run from Saul, so they help him. And then they leave. The David and his guys leave. But then shortly after that, Saul's men come in and they realize that the priests have helped David. Unknowingly, but the priests have helped David against Saul, or to get away from Saul. And Saul, through a man, I think his name is Dog, the Edomite, slaughters the priests. All of them, except for one. All the priests at Nob but one. 1 Samuel chapter 22, verse 20. Only one of the sons of Ahimelech, the son of Ahitub named Abiathar, escaped and fled after David. Only one. And the reason I bring this up is because I can't do this all the time, but if you read these books, 1st, 2nd Samuel, 1st, 2nd Kings, there are all of these prophecies that the storyteller always wants you to see the fulfillment of them. Promises that God makes, often hundreds of years before. And the storyteller wants to say, now look at that. I mean, this is a horrible thing, but you know what this is? As terrible as it is, the slaughter of the priests at Nob with only one being left, this is fulfillment of the word of the Lord to Eli back at the beginning of 1 Samuel in chapters 2 and 3, that not one of his sons and descendants would die a normal death, live to old age. There'd only be one left at one point, left to weep his eyes out. This is what happens in 1 Samuel chapter 22. Well, you read through the rest of 1 Samuel, and there's a lot of interesting things. You see the death of Samuel. See David in some precarious situations, even among his enemies, the Philistines, because he kind of has to, he aligns himself with them, so he finds shelter somewhere. But eventually, 1 Samuel 31, the last chapter, Saul and Jonathan die together in battle. And you think, well, how does David feel about that as you come into 2 Samuel? I mean, you would think David would be rejoicing, right? I mean, his competition, Saul the king, is dead. Jonathan, this potential successor to the throne, is dead. The path is open for David to become the king, and David weeps and laments and mourns over this. He takes no pleasure in the death of Saul, and certainly not in the death of Jonathan, his beloved friend. David mourns and laments over this. And this is actually a theme throughout those sections, is that David will not take vengeance himself. He entrusts his life and his future to the Lord. In fact, twice David has clear opportunities to kill Saul in 1 Samuel 18 to 31, and he will not do it. His men sometimes are like, we should just kill him. And David will not reach out his hand against the Lord's anointed. And now, at the beginning of 2 Samuel, Saul and Jonathan are dead. A man comes and tells David about this and says, actually, I put Saul to death. He asked me to, and I put him to death. And David, the guy thinks he's going to be rewarded by David, and David puts him to death for reaching out his hand against the Lord's anointed. And then David laments over Saul and Jonathan. David will not take vengeance on himself. He's not the kind of king that you would expect. He's the kind of king that you want, though, that you need. The kind who does not take vengeance into his own hands, but entrusts himself to the Lord. Well, by 2 Samuel chapter 5, any other competition has been done away with, been removed, and now all the tribes of Israel gather together to David at Hebron, and they say, behold, 2 Samuel 5, verse 1, we are your bone and flesh. In the times past, when Saul was king over us, it was you, David, who led out and brought in Israel. And the Lord said to you, you, David, shall be shepherd of my people Israel. You shall be prince over Israel. Isn't that something? David, where was he found? Keeping the sheep. There's one kid out there keeping the sheep, but who's he? He's not going to be the king. His own dad was thinking that. And God has taken David from being a shepherd boy out in the fields to now becoming the shepherd of the people of Israel. I think that's interesting, because that means the people of Israel are being presented kind of as a flock, right? And God is putting a king after his own heart over the people to be their shepherd. Kind of like Moses was the shepherd of the people of God in the wilderness. David is going to be the king, and he's going to shepherd the people. And how old was he? Chapter 5, verse 4 of 2 Samuel. He's the Lord's anointed, the Messiah figure, right? And he's 30 years old when he began to reign, and he reigns for 40 years. Reigns over Judah, and then at Jerusalem he reigned over all Israel and Judah for 33 years. Now, you say, okay, what does he do first? First thing he does as king, he goes to the city that he's got his eyes on, the city of Jerusalem, still under the hands of the Jebusites. And David wants to win that city. He wants that city to be the place where he can set up his kingdom, his rule. The people in Jerusalem mock him. You'll never be able to get in here. And David comes and he attacks and he wins the city of Jerusalem. And he sets up his throne, his kingdom there in Jerusalem. This is the city of David. Now, I also want to point out something just as an interesting thing. 2 Samuel chapter 5, verse 13, because up until this point, we're like, this is the guy, this is the man, right? David. But verse 13 of chapter 5, it's just interesting. The author notes, David took more concubines and wives from Jerusalem. Think about that. Now, if you go back, and I don't think that we've looked at it yet, Deuteronomy chapter 17, there's instructions about the king. And one of the warnings is, do not multiply wives. And yet we see David, though he is a man after God's own heart, taking more and more concubines and wives. And you just have to keep it in mind that kind of creates a little angst maybe in our hearts, but as a whole, David is just being established as king. He loves the Lord. He's a man who fights for God's name, who trusts his life, his future to the hands of the Lord, and he is a worshiper of the Lord. 2 Samuel chapter 6, you see it, because David now wants to bring the ark, which has been kind of away from the people. He wants to bring it in so it can be right among the people, and he gathers just thousands, tens of thousands of people to celebrate God, to bring the ark of God into the city. 2 Samuel chapter 6, you see it. They start bringing the ark, which is called by the name of the Lord of hosts. And they carry the ark. This is chapter 6, verse 3. They carry it on a new cart. And so they're bringing it in. And David and all the house of Israel are so happy because he's a worshiper of the Lord. He's leading the people in worship and singing and praising God. And then what happens as they're coming in? The ark begins to topple or stumble or shake because the cart is falling a bit. And so a man named Uzzah reaches out and touches the ark to stabilize it so that it doesn't fall. And what does God do? God kills Uzzah. Just like that. And David gets angry about it. And we think, well, why did God do that? And you have to maybe get familiar with the law of God a little bit and how to transport the ark. And you eventually realize, you know what? It's because David, king, did not follow the word of the Lord about how to carry the ark. It should never have been brought in that way. They shouldn't have been transporting it that way. And you say, but that's so extreme what God did to Uzzah. And I mean, David's heart was full of praise to God. Thousands of people were praising God here together, right? But maybe David is getting a warning at the beginning of his reign. You better follow the word of the Lord. Right motives are not enough. The same lesson that God taught us through the story of Saul, maybe God is reminding us of it right here in the story of David, and David needs to be humbled through this, and he needs to submit his life to the word of the Lord. Well, some time goes by, things settle down, maybe David reads his Bible, and they get ready to bring the ark in again, this time in accordance with the word of the Lord. And it is a day of celebration. 2 Samuel 6, as the ark of the Lord is coming into the city, what is David doing? King David is leaping and dancing before the Lord. He's so excited. He's offering sacrifices. The people are following the praise of their king to the God of Israel. But Michal, his wife, despises him in her heart for his shameful, she thinks, way of worshiping the Lord. All the excitement. He shouldn't be doing this. Look at how he looks in front of the people. But David doesn't care. She'll be judged the rest of her life for despising him in her heart. And David, though, this is a man full of praise to the Lord. He's a worshiper of the Lord like his ancestor Abraham. I mean, this guy, the world's been waiting for a man like this. Someone who's jealous for the name of the Lord, who wants to worship the Lord with all of his heart, with all of his strength, with all of his energy, and who wants to lead all of the people to take joy in God.